Hello, hello. This is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today we are going to be continuing on with our series about the masters of mixing with a mixer named Shawn Everett. Shawn Everett is probably one of the most influential mixers working today. I first got familiar with him, as many people did, with his work with the Alabama Shakes, which was just fantastic sounding. He's worked with a whole bunch of big artists that we'll be looking at more closely today. I have a whole playlist of tracks from Shawn pulled up. There's artists like Alabama Shakes, Beck, Hozier, and so many more. He's worked with a ton of interesting artists. We can look at his work with Kacey Musgraves, with Weezer, and a ton of other major artists. And this guy, I gotta say, is probably one of the most unique mixers out there. And we'll get to hear how some of his mixes work, what makes them work, and how they sound relative to other mixers working with the same artists on the same albums. So this whole playlist that I have pulled up for you, that I will put a link to down in the show notes, you can check out this stuff for yourself, checking out his work with the Alabama Shakes, both on a record that he did for them, Sound and Color, really their big breakthrough, compared to their first record, Boys and Girls, which sounds totally different and was mixed by the band themselves. We'll also hear him against some other major mixers, people like Manny Marroquin, people like Andrew Sheps, people like Serban Ghenea on records by Beck, on records by Hozier. Hozier is an interesting one. This is an artist that's been coming up a lot for my mastering clients. In my work as a platinum mastering engineer, people are always sending me references and records to listen to, and Hozier is one that's been coming up a lot lately. And he's mixed some of the biggest Hozier tracks, and we'll see how they compare to his Hozier's work with other major mixers. The stuff on the Kacey Musgraves records is very interesting because his work sounds totally different than any of the other mixers on those records. He's branched out from some of this hip stuff that we'll look at, like Big Thief, Local Natives, all these like hip bands. He's branched out from that stuff. Recently, he did a record with Miley Cyrus. So we can dive into some of that stuff as well. And also I have some of the hip stuff pulled up, like Slowdive, Local Natives, Vampire Weekend, Kurt Vile, and a whole bunch of stuff he's done, not just with Haim, but with Weezer. Bunch of tracks with Weezer. I'm really into this guy's work. But to tell you the truth, I have not spent a lot of time listening to interviews or watching master classes with Shawn yet. I've done a little bit of that, and I'll give you some of my key takeaways from what I've heard him talk about. But my favorite way to analyze the work of actual mixers is to listen to their music. And today we're going to listen to the mixes together, and I'll give you my notes for exactly what's happening in these mixes, what makes them work the way that they do, and how you can sound more or less like these mixes depending on your personal taste, style, and aesthetic. With all that rambling out of the way, let's get right into checking out some tracks. The only quick shout out I've got to give you is this podcast is free as always. Thanks to our sponsors. And the most important sponsor always is you. How do you sponsor this episode? Hit the like button, hit subscribe, notifications bell, all that good stuff. Or check out some of our great full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, Compression Breakthroughs, EQ Breakthroughs, Change the Way You Work Forever, for the better, or your money back. Also, big shout out and thanks to Sound Toys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. All right, so let's get right into listening some tracks together, and I'll give you some of my notes on these tracks. Let me pull up my screen share here. And the artist that I want to start with is Alabama Shakes, to give you a sense for just how much of a difference mixing in general can make. So we'll go with the first Alabama Shakes record, the one that he did not mix. I believe this was mixed by the band, by the artists themselves. And then we'll listen to some of their second record, Sound and Color, which he did mix. So in this playlist, when you pull it up for yourself, all the odd number tracks are tracks that Shawn mixed, and all the even number ones are tracks that were mixed by somebody else, where possible, on the same album, with the same producer and engineer, from the same studio, with the same mastering engineer, all the other stuff the same. And I'm even trying to put songs with similar arrangements and tempos next to each other. So as much as possible, we can really compare mixing aesthetic and mixing choices. So without further ado, a track that was not mixed by Shawn from Alabama Shakes, Boys and Girls, track called Hold On. Here we go. really great human performances. And the mixes here are totally good. And I don't think it was mixed just by the band. I think there is another professional working with them. These are really decent overall mixes. They have such a cool vibe. They feel super retro. They do not feel like they're from the time that they were made. But now let's listen to what Shawn Everett did. One of their bigger tracks called Don't Want to Fight off the next album, Sound and Color. Here we go.
What you like, what I like, why can't we both be right? Attacking, defending.
There's development in this mix, not just in the performance, but also the mix. I mean, I'm hearing that reverb develop over time. But what is the elements that you notice, or what are the elements that you notice first that really make this mix pop? Because I mean, this one pops so much more than the prior track. The prior track from the prior album, good mix, great performances, but there's just something that is so much bigger, so much more three-dimensional about this mix from Shawn Everett. What are the things that stand out to you? Well, the very first thing that stands out, obviously, in the beginning is width, how much wider this record is. It makes the prior Alabama Shakes record sound practically mono, which it's not. Let's listen to this opening one more time and see if you can distinguish not just the width, but where the width is coming from. What exactly is Shawn doing with mix choices to make it feel that much dramatically wider? Here we go. Let's listen to that opening one more time. All right, so big thing here. We have double-tracked guitar, and they are playing a similar rhythmic part, but they are not identical. There is a difference in timbre on both sides, and our reverb is not like a stereo reverb, where we're just putting stereo guitars through a stereo reverb. We have a reverb that's leaning extremely heavily to the left side, and I actually wouldn't be surprised if I'm hearing a spring reverb from the right pan guitar on the left. I wouldn't be surprised if that's what's happening. But we really have a reverb that is glued to one side and then totally different ambience on the right side. So a big difference in reverb between left and right, and significant enough differences in both the rhythm and timbre of the performances left and right. Some people think they can get extreme width just by double tracking identical guitar parts with identical guitar tones through identical amps, panning them left and right, and that's going to give them width. Or maybe they think they can go a little bit further and get slightly different timbres on either side. Maybe I'll have my condenser mic on the amp on one side and my dynamic mic on the amp on the other side, and that'll get me width. But we can hear here what is giving us real width is contrast between left and right, having rhythmically distinct and tonally distinct parts, and in this case, having distinct ambience on both sides. And that continues as soon as the kick drum drops. And another thing that's happening here is the way that Shawn Everett treats instruments, particularly like kick drum and low percussion instruments. He is unafraid to push more saturation into his low frequency instruments than a lot of people are comfortable doing. The only other mixer I find who saturates low frequency instruments quite as much as this would be Manny Marroquin, and maybe Andrew Sheps does a little bit of it as well, but he'll take organic sounding kicks and just be unafraid of really saturating them, particularly in the mid-range. Now there is a depth in this kick drum, and it extends way deeper than the kick drum on the prior record, so that's part of what doing it for us. But the bass in the kick drum is not just coming from the low end. It is coming from this saturated, ample mid-range. Listen for that. And let me see if I can also bring up my frequency analyzer as we're doing that. And I'll give you some ideas as we go along that Shawn likes to give on how to get these kinds of effects and how to think about the frequency spectrum. So let me pull that up real quick and we'll listen to this and look at the kick on the frequency analyzer as well. That's just such a good squeak. But also what's happening here is not just the kick, the way that he is treating the bass completely differently than the kick. The bass and the kick both live in totally different registers. They both live in the mid-range, but neither of them get in the way of each other. And he's not trying to make either of them sound pretty. He doesn't really care about any of the individual instruments here sounding pretty. In isolation, this kick is going to sound relatively distorted and saturated and messed up if you solo it. The bass is going to sound a little bit tubby and not impressive and not super scooped sounding when you're listening to an isolation, but as puzzle pieces, they fit together very nicely and stay out of each other's way. Let's keep on going a little bit further and listen to how he's using reverb on this record. Then we'll go into some other styles of music.
Your line, don't cross them lines.
And again, we still hear two radically different guitar sounds that are panned hard left and hard right. And he's unafraid of giving us that left-right contrast and the ambience of those two guitar sounds being different on either side. And that's giving us true stereo width. The vocal, what's happening with the vocal reverb? Listen for that.
You like what I like. Why can't we both be right? Attack it.
Now, there's a lot of compression on that vocal. And this is another thing Shawn is not afraid of doing, is compressing things a lot. I often hear very compressed individual drums, very compressed vocals. He's unafraid to heavily compress acoustic guitar, banjo, other things that I've heard him heavily compress, shakers, odd percussion. There's just so many things he's willing to put a lot of compression on. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's some compression after the ambience. I'd have to listen to that one more time. Let's listen to that.
Attacking, defending.
Ooh, but then it blossoms out. It's interesting. On one of these loud belted notes, it almost sounds like the vocal is sucking down the reverb, and on one of them it doesn't. This could be just me imagining things. So I'm just thinking out loud here about things that may or may not be happening. But also, a lot of good mixes have a lot of movement in them, and a lot of the best mixers are not afraid to automate throws here and there, and aren't afraid to have mixes that develop over time instead of imagining that they're going to get one static EQ setting and level setting for the entire song that's going to ride for the entire song. They're often having different balances for different sections, and even within sections, doing rides potentially on things like vocals, but also on things like ambience and interesting reverbs. But one of the things you'll notice here is that the reverb vocal, the vocal on the reverb, the vocal reverb, I should say, is totally different sounding than the guitar reverbs, right? We have these springy sounding amp reverbs on the electric guitars, probably from the amp themselves. And then the reverb that is on the vocal is totally different. And it is not the same reverb as either on the guitars or any of the other instruments in the mix, as far as I can tell. It is a somewhat brighter reverb, a somewhat longer reverb, and one that's a little bit separated from the vocal, probably with a somewhat significant pre-delay. Listen in for some of that stuff and hear how this reverb on the vocal separates a little bit from the vocal, possibly with pre-delay and also from being significantly EQ'd. Feel how it really lingers as a surprisingly long reverb, but he can get away with it because he's not using this surprisingly long characterful reverb on everything. It is really just a vocal feature reverb. And if anything, other elements either have weird springs on them or much shorter room reverbs, which is a very common approach to good mixing.
Defending until there's nothing left worth winning.
Man, and some of those reverb tails he really just lets ride, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's actually riding up some reverb tails occasionally on some spots in the mix, but don't know for sure. All that I know is that some of those reverb tails are really allowed to hang for an unexpectedly long time when there isn't another vocal beat immediately following. So those are some of the things that I noticed. Obviously, the mix is also a whole lot louder than the first Alabama Shakes record. The first Alabama Shakes record, if we listen to the level here,
Life is so homesick. Where's my home? Where I belong, or where I was born? I was told to go where the wind.
super quiet by comparison, right? That's a better mix for their first record. And then here again is another track off of the record that Shawn did.
I must be sound and color with me for my mind, and the she'll show me where to go when I need to speak.
And again, he's getting this extreme width from this kind of vibraphone, marimba-like instrument. But much louder mixes. That's actually one of the quieter ones on the record. If we go back to the one we were listening to earlier.
Until there's nothing left worth winning.
You're just not going to get that level out of
Where I was born, I was told to go where.
this type of mix aesthetic. And it is one of these records that is mixed and mastered, significantly loud, but not at the sacrifice of it sounding interesting. But here's the thing. There's distortion all over this record. There's intentional clipping all of this record. There's heavy limiting and heavy compression over all of this record. But it's still a great sounding record because of tasteful choices. And these kinds of sounds you're not going to get unless you're unafraid of leading into things like limiters, like compressors, like saturators. All right, let's move on to something totally different. I'm again going to give you context of what more normal mixing sounds like by playing you a mix that is not one of Shawn's from another great mixer who we've reviewed on this channel before, a guy named Serban Ghenea, who is famous for mixing some of the biggest pop hits of the last 30 years now. So one track he mixed off of a Beck record, Serban Ghenea, is called Uneventful Days, and it has Serban's signature sound that is so smooth and glossy, and he really carves out kind of some of the center mid-range for this kind of glassy and open feeling. Let's listen to a little bit of Serban's mix for Uneventful Days off the Beck record Hyperspace, and then we'll follow up by listening to Shawn. Here we go.
Uneventful days, uneventful nights, living in the dark, waiting for the light. Caught up in these never-ending battle lines. Everything has changed, nothing it feels right. No, I know, I know, I know, I know, I know it's gone. I know, whoa, whoa, whoa. No, I know it's gone, yeah. Never-ending days, never-ending nights. Everything I say, no one can get right.
It's unusual to hear Beck with that much auto-tune on his voice. With that in your ear, let's listen to a little bit of how Shawn Everett approaches the same album, Hyperspace, song called Stratosphere by Beck, which clients have brought to me as a reference before in mastering sessions. Here we go.
Turn me around.
Just from the opening phrase, turn me around, I already hear the difference in personality of what parts of the frequency spectrum Shawn likes to accent compared to Serban most of the time. Immediately, there's more forward mid-range. This kind of center mid-range is coming forward just a little bit more. There's this almost like relatively crunchy vibe about Shawn's approach relative to a guy like Serban. Serban is on the end of some of the smoothest mixers that exist. Serban is far on the end of that. And Shawn goes a little bit more towards the crunchier mixers who exist. So just a different tonal balance right off the bat. Part of his personality coming through.
Turn me around. Vision comes with the sun.
And again, him being unafraid of these extremely long reverbs that almost become like a second pad-like instrument, almost using some of his effects like sound design to almost create new instruments in the mix. That's something that I remember actually hearing in one of the interviews I did listen to with Shawn, him talking about learning a little bit of that, I think from Tom Elmhurst, saying he was listening to some of the records that Tom Elmhurst did with Adele and being impressed by how long he let reverbs hang. And I really feel like Shawn ran with that approach. You can really hear it on this mix in particular.
The sun far above the ground, halfway to oblivion in the stratosphere. There's nowhere to go from here, from the stratosphere. I'll be back home another year.
Now, before the rest of the track drops, a couple of things I want to note about this. Shawn is doing things here that you may already be doing in your own mixes. He's going for this very pop convention of these super wide pan acoustic guitars and super wide pan background vocals. And they're both relatively bright, which I hear in a lot of intermediate mixes. One thing that Shawn is doing particularly well here, though, is that the acoustic guitars are not glued to the front of the speaker, and the sibilance is not leaping off of the side panned vocals, and the transients on the acoustic guitars are really well controlled. I often hear mixers trying to go for this aesthetic who aren't as far along in their career as Shawn is, and what they're often missing is that the transients are just leaping out of the acoustic guitars. It brings them really far forward in the speakers, and they feel kind of haphazard dynamically. And these wide pan background vocals, what a lot of folks will do is they're trying to go for this bright, airy sound, and they won't de-ess the bejesus out of them, or at least find some way to control the area where the sibilance in the vocals would otherwise stand out. I'm going to back up just a little bit and listen for how, although they're bright, they're never painful when it comes to sibilance on vocals or attack on vocals or acoustic guitar. There is ample softening of the front end transient on these sounds without making them sound dull.
Be back home another year.
It's interesting here, just when you thought that the mix was going to be as wide as it could get, I feel like it got a little bit wider. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some movement in the panning of the acoustic guitars. I don't know if it's that, or there's some other tricks in the arrangement pulling my ears out further. Let's see if I can get to a section where there's drums in this track to see how he handles those.
Somewhere I could disappear.
It's interesting. I almost feel like there's some development in the snare drum over time. Like I feel like there was this thuddier sound that eventually became sharper. Let's listen back to that.
Somewhere I could disappear.
I don't know what's doing that for me. This, like in this passage, I felt like the snare drum started a little brighter and then became duller and more thuddy and then brightened back out again. Again, I don't know if that's something that Shawn is automating some movement into, or if that's already existing in the production, or if that's a trick of other elements coming in and out. But there's enough of a change there where I wouldn't be surprised if there's some intentional movement in there. I could be reading into this too much, but let me know if you hear that as well. The snare going from somewhat crisp to somewhat thuddy to somewhat crisper again. But that is something that I've definitely seen Shawn do either way. The fact that he is unafraid to go really thuddy with instruments like snare drum and make them sound stupid and say, no, this is the kind of snare drum we have. I'm not trying to make it sound like a natural, normal snare drum in the studio. We're going for thuddy snare drum. What's the frequency balance and the transient to sustained balance is going to make this thing sound thuddy. We're going thuddy. And I've heard him do the exact opposite, where he's like, okay, we want this thing to have as much like fuzz and edge on it as possible. And I've heard him definitely bring out almost an unrealistic amount of the kind of underside snare band sound of a drum with like really bright snarey sounds. And so we're not just hearing the impact, but hearing the drum sizzle out. So he's really unafraid to just say, I'm going to do something weird with this drum. I'm going to make it sound interesting. I'm going to make it sound potentially dumb and wrong, but in a way that works with the mix. So if you can get anything from Shawn's approach, I hope it could be courage, because it takes a lot of courage to do the kinds of things that he's doing. He's probably in many cases morphing things to some degree from where they started in the original production and arrangement, trying to find what's in there, and then like what's the personality of the snare and how do I go and enhance that and make it even more of what it is. So he's often doing a lot of stuff like that. Let's now check out Hozier. And on Hozier, I want to do the same thing. I want to start with somebody else's mix that's quite good. I think Andrew Sheps' best sounding mix on the album, Wasteland Baby from Hozier, is a track called Movement. And this one has been sent to me a few times from clients as a mastering reference. Really good sounding track from Andrew Sheps. It also is probably one of the better sounding mixes because it's just one of the better songs on the album, most likely. But let's listen to a little bit of Andrew Sheps' mix on this album, and then we'll flip over and hear how Shawn approaches similar material. All right, here's a little bit not mixed by Shawn Everett, mixed by Andrew Sheps, Movement from Hozier, Wasteland Baby. Here we go.
Still watch you when you're grooving, as if through water from the bottom of a pool. You're moving without moving, and when you move, I'm moved. You are a call to motion. There all of you a verb in perfect view, like Jonah on the ocean. When you move, I'm moved. When you move, I'm put to mind of all that I wanna be. When you move, I could never define all that you are to me. So move me, baby, shake like the bottom willow tree. You do it naturally. Move me, baby.
Yeah. This is a really good mix, really good production, very good performance. And it's a really good mix too. I mean, just everything is right here. And I could go and analyze Sheps' mix. He's one of these other guys who's not afraid to mix a little bit mid-rangey. I feel like I put like Manny Marroquin, a little bit of Shawn Everett, Andrew Sheps, and I'm arguing with myself whether or not I want to put Chad Blake in this same category, because Chad Blake sometimes goes a little bit brighter and a little bit more open. But those three guys, particularly Manny, Shawn, and Andrew, are unafraid to be like a little crunchy, a little mid-rangey. I'd almost say Tom Elmhurst does that kind of thing too. Now let's listen to a little bit of Shawn with the same artist, same album. This track, Almost Sweet Music. So do you hear how unafraid Shawn is to make this kick drum just sound weird? He's like, we're going for thuddy, muted sounding kick drum that's far away, and we're going to do that up. I'm not going to do a little bit of it. We're going to go like as far in that direction as you can go before you ruin it. And maybe actually slightly past the point where you ruin it to where it's good again. So that's what I'm hearing here. This total lack of fear to take a kick drum sound or a snare sound and just make it weird and say that's the personality the record's going to have. And also his lack of fear of being a little bit mid-rangey and a little bit crunchy sounding, because this mix is even crunchier than we were hearing out of Andrew Sheps. Let's keep going.
I came in from the outside, burned out from a joyride. She likes to roll here in my ashes anyway. Played from the bedside, still about starlight. There was my heart, the drums that start off night and day. The same kind of music haunts her bedroom. I'm almost me again, she's almost you. And I wouldn't know where to start. Sweet music playing in the dark. Be still my foolish heart, don't ruin this on me.
Again, incredible width. This is one of the things that I feel like he has in common with Chad Blake, another one of my favorite mixers we've also explored in this series, where he just makes things sound so super wide, and he is unafraid of making things be saturated. But I want you also really try to hear the distinctly different reverbs that he's using. I mean, the kick drum reverb, to me, sounds like it has nothing to do with the vocal reverb. I think it's very unlikely that they're both the same reverb and that we're just hearing the difference in the kick and the vocal through those reverbs. I believe that these are two differently curated reverbs. We have this surprisingly long reverb on the kick and surprisingly long dark reverb on some of the other backing elements. And then in this particular one, we have a relatively, at least for Shawn, relatively short and bright sounding vocal reverb. So just listen and try to get a sense in your mind for what kind of space are we in with the kick drum, how you would achieve that with your own reverbs. It's probably by EQing it like crazy. And then listen to what is distinctly different about the kind of reverb, both in length and in EQ balance that's on the vocal. Listen for that.
I'm
Back it up just a little bit.
Still about to roll here in my ashes anyway.
You probably get an even better sense if I start right before the vocal comes in.
Came in from the outside. I came in from the outside, burned out from a joyride. She likes to roll here in my ashes anyway. Played from the bedside, still about starlight. There was my heart, the drums that start off night and day. The same kind of music.
So that's something I want you to start thinking about, how you can use disparate reverbs without making them sound like they're recorded in totally different environments. We're giving them each their own space within the architecture that's available between the two speakers, right? The kick drum and the vocals live in different spots, but they're still within the same universe, even though they have totally different sounding reverbs around them. And part of that comes from bus processing. Part of what's gluing this stuff together is he's not afraid of having extreme contrast between individual instruments, but there's also ways in which things are extremely glued together and are moving together. Part of that, I believe, comes from bus processing, which I'm a big advocate of. Not just necessarily mixed bus processing, although I did see a shot of Shawn's chain, and he has like every single plugin slot on his mix bus has a plugin on it, pretty much. But I believe he's probably also doing some amount of mixing through subgroups, because he has this great way of making elements feel like they're moving together. And often that comes from group dynamics processing. All right, let's go on a little bit further and check out a totally different artist, and we'll get a totally different view of how Shawn's work compares to others, because there's two different types of things that I hear from Shawn. One of them is sometimes he has the biggest, most impressive, widest sounding mixes on the record, and sometimes he has the exact opposite of that. The most mid-rangey and weird and low rent sounding mixes on the record. And we'll hear a couple of examples of that. And I think this Kacey Musgraves record is a good example of it, because what we have is this dichotomy between conventional pop mixing and then like, oh, this is a weird track, let's give it to Shawn. And then Shawn goes in and is unafraid to make the track not sound impressive. And on this record we're about to hear, he has some of the quietest mixes and some of the least enveloping and dazzling sounding mixes. But they potentially have some of the most emotionality in them and some of the greatest intimacy. So we're going to hear something very different here. Let's go back to our playlist. So again, here's a song on this Kacey Musgraves record that Shawn did not do. I forget the mixer on it, but more conventional pop / alt country mix. Not mixed by Shawn. Here we go. Already you can tell how these acoustic guitars sound absolutely nothing like any of the acoustic guitars we've heard on any of the Shawn Everett mixes at all. I mean, they're beautiful sounding acoustic guitars. They're very nice, mainstream, middle of the road, top 40, pretty clean sounding acoustic guitars. But they are not what people are hiring Shawn Everett to do, right? Listen to this.
Even something as small as an apple, it's simple and somehow complex, sweet and divine, the perfect design. Can I speak to the architect? There's a canyon that cuts through the desert.
Nice. I think there's a weird thing going on in the mix for me where I feel like they have a surprising amount of like full-bodied mid-range in the vocal. Like there's this low mid and center mid thing in the vocal that makes it feel like homespun Americana. But then the guitars are very surprisingly bright and open and scooped sounding compared to the vocal. And I'm almost surprised by that dichotomy. This is, again, not Shawn's mix, but that's just something I'm noticing.
Did it get there because of a flood?
But let's move over now to a totally different approach. This is Shawn Everett mixing a track on Deeper Well called Deeper Well. Here we go. Do you hear how much further back from the front of the speakers these acoustic guitars are? They're still bright, they're still pretty, but there's something that's a little bit softened about them. Let's keep going.
Saturn has returned. When I turned 27, everything started to change.
And totally different approach to the vocal. We're not any longer going for a very natural sounding, full-bodied centered vocal. This is a stereo vocal double that is significantly compressed. And I'm hearing some compression artifacts, like certain front end attack of notes jumping out more than others.
Took a long time, but I learned there's two kinds of people. One is a giver, and one's always trying to take all they can take. So I'm saying goodbye to the people that I feel are real good at wasting my time. No regrets, baby, I just think that maybe you go your way and I'll go mine. It's been a real good time.
So very different presentation, where the acoustic guitars sit, where the vocals sit, compared to this. Right, where it's super dry, super upfront, very crystalline, in addition to having some woodiness to them. Let's have another listen to another kind of mainstream-ish, conventional pop mix from a different mixer, and then we'll listen to some more of Shawn. So here's another track off this record, not mixed by Shawn.
I saw a sign or an omen on the branches in the morning. It was right after I lost a friend without warning.
Actually, this one is a little bit less of a conventional pop mix. And let's listen to another track by Shawn.
Through the roots of the
again, here, Shawn doing probably the widest sounding mix on the record. And this is interesting. He has so little to work with to get width in the beginning, but he starts getting width from the very beginning. In this case, again, from doing very hard panned vocals. But the spatialization on this is really interesting because the mix is somewhat sparse. His kick drum is leaning a little bit to the left and it's fairly distant. And we hear that in the other kick drum on this Kacey Musgraves record. He almost doesn't care if you hear it. Like, he wants you to hear it, but he's not trying to impress you with how big and upfront the kick drum is. He wants you to feel like it's there, and if you notice it, you're going to notice how unusual and interesting it is, rather than just hammering you over the head with a kick drum.
In the heart of the wood.
There's just so much more distance and space in this one compared to the other kind of quirky sounding mix that we were hearing on this record. He just goes even further in that direction. All right. There's a whole bunch of other things we can look at. I've got more Kacey Musgraves. I've got Pete Yorn, tracks that he did and someone else did. Let's go to a totally different style. A whole bunch of Weezer tracks that we could listen to. There was one that I thought was interesting. Maybe it was a Slowdive one. Let me see if I can bring that up. If I can find this on my list. I put in a couple. Yeah, some Slowdive tracks. This is another one where you can hear the difference between, I believe this was the artist mixing themselves in this case, and then the other one is mixed by Shawn. And this is this is pretty recent. Is this a reissue or Slowdive actually putting out a new album, 2023? I've got to look this up with you guys. I didn't know Slowdive were putting out new records. Let's double check here. They formed in 1989. Did they just put out a record in 2023? Reunion and new albums. I guess so. They had finished a new album, the lead single being Kisses. Okay, so this is a new Slowdive record. I had no idea Slowdive were back together and putting out new albums, but they just released one in June of 2023. So we're going to hear a little bit of that. So again, I have Shawn's are the odd numbers, and then the even numbers are from some other mixer. In this case, I think it's actually the artists themselves. So here's first, not Shawn's mix. Here we go. Let's jump further across into a slightly more dense section. It's fine, totally competent. And let's hear Shawn's approach to the same type of material on the same album. I mean, so much more clarity and detail than the self-mixed stuff, but I also hear some restraint here where I feel like Shawn is trying to intentionally not blow away the other stuff on the record, but to have it kind of fit in with and feel like it can come next to, before or after other songs that the artist may have mixed themselves or with a less experienced engineer. But the big difference I'm hearing here, again, is with Shawn is one of these masters of width. I think him and Chad Blake are two of the widest sounding mixers I've ever heard. I think he's amazing at that. But also his willingness to get so much of the low end to come from the lower end center mids. Like, he's not the kind of guy who's trying to get you to hear all the low end by just putting a ton of 50 hertz or a ton of 80 hertz into his low end. He's not just boosting a lot of bottom. And he's not also one of those kinds of guys who is trying to amp up the upper mid range. I'm going to make you hear my kick by putting a lot of 2K or 4K or 5K into it. He's really allowing drums to often live in this kind of center mid area where he's giving them their personality somewhere between 200 hertz and 2K. Like, that's one of the things that to me is distinctive about how he lets drums sit. And if we hear the kick drum on this, it's almost like in a totally different world of high end than the rest of the band. There's so much more clarity here, but underneath it is this substrate of kick and bass, which are relatively muted sounding and relatively spacious and not like way up front, glued to the front of the speaker, like you hear in a lot of other mixers. Listen to that one more time, just how softened the top end is on the kick and bass without it being indistinct or boomy or muddy or excessively deep. Here we go. So almost no top on this pad, and very distant, which allows the incredible contrast of our snare and our other elements dropping in, allowing them to sound really bright and detailed. I mean, this transition is huge. And I take it back. The things I was saying about the low end apply in this track more to the bass than the kick. This is a relatively tight sounding kick for Shawn's usual stuff. But listen to that bass line, how tubby and veiled it's allowed to be.
Tell me you're the best thing. Tell you that's what you need. Rolling on those good love. Maybe it's just enough. I know you dream of snowfield, floating high above the trees, a living for the new thing. Sometimes the new won't do.
And that is just a far cry from this. Right, the mix from the other mixer now sounds relatively kind of pinched and mid-rangey and narrow when we A/B. Like, everything's competing for real estate in the same area. This area from, 300 to 2K, like everything is just in there fighting with each other. But if we hear the approach from Shawn, it's like he's opened up this additional real estate. There's now places we can put things on the sides, and there's this like stratification of elements where each of them kind of slots in to their compartment, like the strata of the mix, like the earth strata. Is it strata when it's in the earth, or is that only clouds? Is the geological term strata when there's like layers of rock? There are different types of rock. Well, anyway, whether or not strata is the right term for geology, do that in your mixes, because that's what Shawn's doing. All right, let's check how long I've been rambling now on this episode. We're in the 49-minute mark. I'm going to read through some of your comments, and then I'm going to sign out for the day. Tanner, great to have you here. Coldacre, great to have you here. Benj, great to have you joining. Brad, good to have you here. Nice to see all you folks. Let's see if there's any. I did say low rent at a certain point. Lots of different opinions in here. No specific questions. Bradley says, they are the masters always trying to amp up the upper mid-range. It depends. I mean, honestly, there are certain mixers, like this is one of the things I notice when I study the work of mixers and we compare, like I hear the way that their ears work, and all their ears work slightly differently. Like they each have different areas that they run to get clarity out of, and different areas that they run to get body out of, just because we all hear things differently. And there's not necessarily one right way to mix a track and one right way to kind of make there be different strata in your mix, right? There's multiple ways to make that happen. All right, a few notes I want to give you here. One of the things that I thought was interesting is a piece of advice that Shawn gave in one of the interviews and videos that I checked out was this idea of being able to listen to frequency bands independently. And I think this is a big thing that factors into his skill and success as a mixer. He really does this thing where he tries to figure out what area, usually in the mid-range and sometimes in the low end, what area each instrument should live in. And the way that he does this is by taking a multi-band compressor and not using it as a compressor, but just using it to solo different bands and just listen to the area from 50 to 100 hertz and say, what's in there? Like how much low frequency is in 50 to 100 hertz on some of my favorite records compared to my records. And now I'm going to listen to the area, say, between 200 hertz and 500 hertz. And what's there? Am I hearing my kick there or my bass there? Which is winning in this area? Is the kick winning? Is the bass winning? And when I zero into the area between 500 and 2K, and I listen to this kind of center mid band, what's winning there? So he actually does this to his mixes, evaluating them. And I do a similar thing with frequency analyzers as I'm checking out my masters that I do. I'll often bring up a frequency analyzer. Not that I'm trying to use the frequency analyzer to master through, but I do a similar kind of analysis where I say to myself, oh man, okay, there's some buildup in a certain area where I feel like there's a fight between these two elements, or the kick drum is sticking out excessively because it has a bunch of emphasis in this area. And I think that area in this case is 250. And I go in and I double check the frequency analyzer and I see that, oh, okay, there it was, 280 hertz. I'm going to pull that down a little bit. I kind of confirmed my guess. But he's doing this in a very kind of proactive way. And I think this is one of the things that made the Auratone and the NS10 monitors so popular for so long, is they really force you to focus in on the mid-range and make sure that everything can be heard when you take the extreme lows and the extreme highs out of the equation so that you're getting your mid-range right. The part of the frequency spectrum that is the most important to get right, and that's going to be reproduced on the greatest variety of systems. But he goes one step further, not by just taking a little NS10, which he does mix through, or a little Auratone and narrowing it that way. He narrows things even further and looks through his mix every once in a while through this little microscope, this little magnifying glass of, let's get hyper-focused. What do I have loaded into the 200 to 500 range? And what do some of my favorite mixes do there? What elements are really in there, 200 to 500? What's winning in that band? And what's winning in that band in my mix? And what should be winning in that band in my mix? So he's willing to listen to his whole mix through slices. And even if this isn't something that I would feel comfortable doing mixing myself, I've gone through that kind of exercise so many times in evaluating other mixes that I've heard, that it's one of the things that's helped train me to do mastering. And I do master now at a reasonably good level. I mean, I have platinum mastering credits, and my mastering has not stopped records from being heard hundreds of millions of times. And part of that did come from that kind of training of listening to tons of reference material while looking at it on a frequency analyzer and while doing this analysis of, what's really happening in this specific range. So I kind of realized that I've done a similar thing to Shawn, and it was one of the most important ear training things that I did that really stuck with me. But he's apparently doing it in an active way, even on new mixes today, not just for initial development. So I think that's a really interesting thing. All right, guys, thanks so much for hanging out with me. It's been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Last quick notice is, if you got anything out of this podcast and you haven't minded hearing me ramble about music production for 50 minutes, you might like my fully scripted, extremely tight and well-edited, full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, Compression Breakthroughs, EQ Breakthroughs. They're guaranteed to change the way that you work forever for the better or your money back. Mixing Breakthroughs will give you a whole system to mixing that allows you to unlock creativity and fearlessness in mixing. Often, what's holding a lot of us back in mixing is fear and is lack of confidence. And a lot of your confidence can come from the kinds of exercises like the one that I've described that are in the course Mixing Breakthroughs, as well as additional exercises I give you that are going to improve both your chops and your confidence and give you a system that will unlock your creativity. Also, check out EQ breakthroughs if you really want to learn to hear each of the EQ bands distinctly from one another, so you can always grab the right spots on each element and really understand how different elements can fit together with EQ better than before. Check out EQ breakthroughs. It really does change the game. Also, compression breakthroughs is a big one that will change the way that you hear and use compression forever. Again, making you more fearless in using compression, because a guy like Shawn Everett is extremely fearless when it comes to using things like compression and saturation. And once you really understand these tools, understand what they sound like when you push them too hard, understand how sometimes pushing them too hard can be a creative effect that you do to your own benefit, you can learn all about that in compression breakthroughs. Also, big shout out and thanks to our homies over at Sound Toys. I would be unsurprised if Shawn Everett uses a whole bunch of Sound Toys plugins. In fact, I'm absolutely certain that he does. I've seen them in some of his sessions. So check out any of their stuff that they make totally for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. Some of the most wonderful plugins for mixing out there. Check them out, soundtoys.com. 30 days, get their stuff for free to try. Also, remember to hit like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Thanks for hanging out with me. It's been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. It will continue being Justin Colletti of SonicScoop for the foreseeable future. And hopefully until, the whole time I'm alive, I'd like to still be Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for hanging out with me. See you next time.